Good evening, welcome to day number 5 of Identity Defined. This is part of Aberystwyth Christian Union's Events Week, where every day we're going to be having an event where we look at a different aspect of identity and what the Bible has to say about that. My name's Josh, I'm going to be hosting this evening. This event's going to look a little different to the ones that we've done already this week. This event is called Defined by DNA, Has Biology Made God Redundant? And instead of having a live speaker with us, we're going to be watching a video. Jon couldn't be with us today, but we're really glad that he's got this video to share with us.
Good evening. My name's Jon Dawson. I'm here speaking to you from my house in Southampton. I work here for the university in the Faculty of Medicine, where I'm a principal investigator exploring the very interesting topic of stem cells and regenerative medicine. I'm trying to understand how we can use different materials and molecules to stimulate stem cells to help repair the body. But I'm not going to be talking to you about that this evening. I'm going to be speaking to you in a personal capacity on this topic of whether science has made God redundant. This is part of a whole week of events put on by the Christian Union, with the hope of giving you an opportunity to think and explore the Christian message for yourself. Our motivation in doing this is really quite simple. Christians call their message gospel. Gospel literally means good news. And it's good because it shows us that fundamentally behind everything is a God who is love. So the reason you and I exist is not because of some great big cosmic accident that threw us into being. We're not here on the whim of some all-powerful deity who made us with a flex of his muscles just because he can, but we're here out of the overflowing generosity of a God who at his core is love. And if that's true, it changes everything. It means that the purpose of a life, the reason we're to live, is not ultimately to survive long enough to pass on our genes, nor is it to pass some great big moral exam to somehow validate our existence. No, we're here to live out our potential as human beings made in the image of this God, to know him and love him and explore and understand his creation and to care for it, and to love and care for each other. It's a fundamentally humanizing and life-affirming message. It's good news. And yeah, we're very aware that there's all kinds of very serious and significant objections and suspicions that many of us have about this message. And so really through these talks, we're trying to address some of these issues and objections head on. And our hope ultimately is to kind of open up investigations once again, which may have stalled for various reasons because of these questions. And the big question we're thinking about today is this question of whether science has made these kind of beliefs illegitimate, redundant, or somehow completely out of court. Now I'm going to try a Zoom advanced share. So let's just see if this works. There we are. Okay, so here are my slides. Great. So has science made God redundant? Now this is a very widespread and fundamental belief. I was watching the Young Sheldon the other day, a spin-off from the very successful and popular Big Bang Theory, and in it you see this precocious young Sheldon take on a Christian minister in the middle of a church service in this dispute between science and belief, and he ends this little dispute by saying simply, science is fact, religion is faith, and I prefer facts. Science is fact, religion is faith, and I prefer facts. There it is, there's the picture. So good episode, a nice little moment worth watching. Now, as a scientist, we might cringe a little bit at Sheldon's rather simplistic take on science as fact, but most of us, I think, would recognize the sentiment. As scientists, we try to ground our beliefs about the world in observation and experiment and logical deductions, and we teach our students to try and explore and understand the way world works by looking for measurable physical mechanisms. And so it's a valid question to ask, is not this way of knowing stuff completely at odds with discussions of religion and faith. The eminent James Watson, who co-discovered with Francis Crick the structure of DNA, was once asked whether he knew many religious scientists, and he replied this. He said, "Occasionally I meet them, and I'm a little bit embarrassed because I cannot believe anyone who accepts truth by revelation." Now, obviously, that hurts my feelings a little bit, but it's an important thing, and it touches a nerve, because I have to think to myself, well, is there a chance I'm living a kind of double life, a kind of schizophrenic existence, where I have one standard of evidence in my day-to-day life as a scientist and a completely different one in my life as a Christian believer? Perhaps you too are interested in the Christian faith, and yet you're worried about having to sacrifice your intellectual integrity. As someone who loves science and the pursuit of knowledge, I can fully understand this concern. And I think if there is a conflict, and if this conflict is real, if a choice has to be made between sure facts and blind faith, I know which way I'd want to go. But I don't think the choice is quite that simple. One of my suspicions that was aroused early in my thinking about this was when I encountered many other scientists who take a very different view from James Watson and co. James Watson's successor as founder, James Watson founded the Great Human Genome Project, this attempt to map the entire human genetic code. His successor was this chap here, Francis Collins, and he wrote a book about the successful mapping of the genetic code, which he was completed under his lead in 2003, I think. And he wrote a book telling of this story and his own development as a scientist, but also his discovery of the Christian faith for himself. And he said this, he said, "I'd started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism, but that now lay in ruins as I was forced to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis." Now, if nothing else, that should give us pause and make us think maybe the choice isn't quite as stark as people like Watson and the young Sheldon would have us believe. Perhaps it is possible to be someone who is completely committed and immersed in the sciences and yet find oneself intellectually compelled towards accepting the Christian faith for themselves. And really, this is what I'd like us to think a bit more about today. So let's try and put our finger on the issue. First of all, someone who nailed it quite well, I think, is this chap here, Peter Atkins, in his essay, The Unlimited Power of Science. And he describes science like this. He says, "Science, the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared, reproducible knowledge, emerged from religion. And as science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath." So according to Atkins, while religion had a role to play in our intellectual history as human beings, that role has now been thoroughly superseded by the power of science. And like a butterfly emerging from a restrictive chrysalis because of science and the light it brings, we're now able to spread our wings and fly like the enlightened butterflies we are. He goes on to say, there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious hope there is a dark corner of the physical universe or of the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. So for Atkins, he's making two very important claims here. First of all, he's talking about the sufficiency of science. That's very clear. There's no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Science, because of its great power, is able to shed its light on all aspects of human existence and give us this kind of complete, fully orbed understanding of the world, the universe, and our place in it. There leaves no room or need for religion. Religion is rendered redundant. But as well as that, he's also claiming for the exclusivity of science. Science is both sufficient but also exclusive in its ability to give us reliable knowledge of the world, this publicly shared, reproducible knowledge that anything else has no match for. And really, it's because of this strong belief that religion alone can give us reliable knowledge of the world, that people like Atkins and co are so keen to try and show us that science is also sufficient for understanding ourselves. Now, there's no denying the power of science. Let me tell you a bit about one of the big breakthroughs in my own research field by this chap here, Shinya Yamanaka from Kyoto University in Japan. He made this breakthrough discovery of the potential to generate what he called induced pluripotent stem cells. The word pluripotent here refers to the ability stem cells have, this unique ability to specialize into all of the different types of cells that make up our adult human bodies. When we were right at the beginning of our life as an embryo, we were basically a little ball of stem cells. Those cells couldn't do much, but they had the potential to turn into brain cells and blood cells and bone cells and all the other hundreds of different cells that make up our body. Now, as our bodies develop and we grow, that potential is very quickly lost from our cells, which means that our ability to use them to regenerate and repair our bodies are somewhat limited. But Shinya Yamanaka discovered that it's possible to kind of turn on or reprogram cells to recover this lost potential again. It's an astonishing discovery. It means that one day scientists may be able to take some old skin cells or even some old cells washed out in your urine, grow them up in the lab, and then reprogram them to become stem cells again, so that the potential they had right at the beginning of our development can be recovered, so that they can then be used to give us new neurons to treat our Parkinson's, or pancreatic cells to treat diabetes, or whatever else. But how did Shinya Yamanaka prove that he had made stem cells? Well, he did a very important experiment. He took some of his reprogrammed stem cells, he labeled them bright green, and then injected them back into an early embryo. Actually, the labeling might have been done by later groups, but the principle is the same. So he took some of his stem cells, he injected them back into an early 3-day-old embryo. Now, if they were normal cells, those cells would have died and not done anything. But if they were stem cells, the idea was that they would then fuse with that other mouse, the mouse embryo, and go on to contribute to the development of that adult mouse. And that's indeed what he found. And so here you can see he made what's called a chimeric mouse, a mouse formed of two distinct genetic identities. Half of that mouse was from the original embryo, and half of that mouse is formed from cells that were only months earlier growing in a flask in Yamanaka's lab. And here's the proof of some of those cells in the mice shining bright green like they were in the beginning. It's a very, very powerful demonstration of an astonishing discovery. And it's exactly this that gives science such credibility in our world. This is the credibility that Richard Dawkins is talking about here. So move away from Richard Dawkins' nose, where he says this: science boosts its claim to truth by its spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command and to predict what will happen and when. Science has the power to change our world, to make predictions about the world like nothing else. And many, therefore, in view of this astonishing power of science, have said, you know what? Science is really the only reliable way we have of knowing anything about our world. And so what we've got to do, if we're to know things about our world responsibly, is limit ourselves to believing things about the world only through what science can tell us. This is a very developed project. One example, one great proponent of this is Daniel Dennett. He wrote a book in the 90s that he humbly entitled Consciousness Explained, although several books have been written since then as well. But he says this: there is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the disadvantages of this, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. We can, in principle, we're not there yet, but scientists are working on it, account for every mental phenomena using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials. Because science is so able to give us reliable knowledge of the world, our method, the principal way of working, is to explain stuff only in terms of physics, chemistry, and physiology. Now that might sound sensible, but it can lead to some very, very counterintuitive and I think quite unsatisfactory explanations. There's lots of examples we could give. I'm just going to choose one. This is, actually, I'm not going to choose this one, I'm going to choose this one. This is Richard Dawkins talking about the topic of love. He's actually being engaged by a Christian interviewer here. And he was asked, when you think about your wife, what does love mean? Dawkins says, well, we've been into that before. It's an emotion which is a manifestation of brain stuff. The interviewer asks, Jesus said love was the purpose of life. Does that sound nonsense to you? Dawkins says, it sounds like something grafted on, a superfluous excrescence on life, which I feel I understand better. But it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So for Richard Dawkins, love is nothing more than a manifestation of brain stuff. And any idea that we have that love is of deeper significance, of a more central significance to what it means to be human, this idea that love lies towards the core of the purpose and meaning of our lives, is actually something we're imposing on reality, something we're reading into reality that's not really there. Now, of course, love is an emotion. Of course, love arises out of the physiology of our brains. But most of us, I think, would want to say that there's something more to it than that, that the love we have for those closest to us, this love we have which drives us to do so much of the good things in our lives, is a meaningful reality that goes beyond simply the physiology of our brains. But Richard Dawkins is very committed to this idea that we should explain ourselves only in terms of biology, physics, and chemistry, and therefore this is really the only type of explanation that's available to him. Now, that's a soft argument against this way of understanding the world. We're essentially saying this doesn't feel right. It feels like there's something more to say than simply physiology. But there's also a harder philosophical argument against what Richard Dawkins is saying here. And the clue to that is in the last thing he says, when he says, it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. He's talking about our brains, why they're in our heads, what they're for. Another philosopher of science also very committed to this idea of trying to reduce the understanding of ourselves down to physiology, chemistry, and physics is this philosopher, Patricia Churchland out of UCLA. And she says this about the function of our brains. Boiled down to essentials, the principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. A fancier style of representing, so she's talking about our ability to think and to try and make sense of the world, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So for Churchland, the reason we think, the reason we try to make sense of the world, the reason we should remind ourselves we do science is not ultimately to discover what's true. Ultimately, our brains are there to help us survive, and that's all. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that sometimes our survival doesn't depend on us having true beliefs. I need to know that it's not a good idea to go and stroke that lion over there. Sometimes truth benefit and survival benefit can align, but not necessarily so by any means. A good example here from Churchland's perspective would be religion. For Churchland and others, religion has very little to say for itself in terms of its truth benefit. Its function is purely in terms of survival, and that is all. But it's not just religion that's susceptible to this critique. Any of our sense-making beliefs are possibly down to simply having survival benefit. And what that means ultimately, and I'm sure you can see the problem, is that ultimately we cannot trust our brains as we try to make sense of the world. We cannot rely on our brains any more then we can rely on our heartbeat to keep track of time, because that's not what our brains are for. Our brains are to help us survive, and that is all. Now, someone who can see the problem with this approach, not a Christian by any means, not a believer, but he recognizes the issue as Raymond Tallis. He says this biologistic image of humans, this attempt to squeeze ourselves only into what biology can tell us about ourselves, effectively denies the possibility of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. If Darwin's On the Origin of Species really was the last word on humanity, it could not have been written. If the only thing there is to say about ourselves is what we're allowed to say because of biology experiments, we can no longer make sense of ourselves. By trying to censor out anything in our human story not validated by a science experiment, our story becomes incoherent. It no longer makes sense. As we try and squeeze ourselves into the type of explanations allowed by biology and chemistry and physics, our understanding of ourselves becomes distorted, and we're no longer to be able to recognize what we are as human beings when we think about ourselves. So it seems in order to understand ourselves, we have no choice but to go beyond what we can learn through biology and chemistry and physics. But there's a problem there, isn't there? That's the very problem we started with. What else is there other than science that could possibly give us such reliable, reproducible knowledge about ourselves? Surely science is the only way of knowing anything. Someone who certainly made a strong case for this was the philosopher Bertrand Russell. In his essays on science and religion, he said, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. A very forceful way of putting it. But I think you can probably see, again, the problem with saying this. Bertrand Russell is clearly claiming to know something here. And yet, I think we can assume that this is knowledge that he has not obtained by doing science experiments. He is not a scientist, he's a philosopher. He arrived at this knowledge by sitting in his armchair, smoking his pipe. He's saying, in other words, that we don't really need to listen to him, so we're not going to. But what I would like us to think about a bit more is the reason behind this mistake, because I think there's a more fundamental mistake still to what Bertrand Russell is saying here. And this is a mistake I found really helpfully articulated by another philosopher of science in a rather old, boring science textbook, where he says this. He says, if he be a man engaged in any important inquiry, according to this chap, only men make this mistake for some reason, he must have a method, and he will be under a strong and constant temptation to make a metaphysics out of his method. That is, to suppose the universe ultimately of such a sort that his method must be appropriate and successful. But saying sounds a bit abstract, but he's describing a very basic mistake. It's a mistake, actually, that I think my young daughter, had learned to avoid by the time she was only about 1 year old. Very impressive, I know. This is a picture of my daughter Anya when she was about just before one year old. Prior to that stage, when she's only about 8 or 9 months, I could be playing with my phone in front of her, and she'd obviously want to play with my phone herself. It was enough at that young age for me to simply take my phone, put it in my pocket, and she would act as if the phone no longer existed, and she'd move on to wanting something else she couldn't have. But by the time she hit 1, that no longer worked. She'd learned something very, very important about the world. She'd learned that just because you couldn't see something didn't mean it wasn't available for her to play with. She just needed to use a different method to get access to that bit of reality she wanted to play with. And so she'd put on a cute face like that and tug on my sleeve, and she'd know that sooner or later she would gain access to the object of her fascination. That latter method has actually proved very versatile over the course of her life. But scientists learn this very early on as well. Scientists know that it's not good science, actually, to say, well, I've got this really great assay, really great method. It always gives me reliable results. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit my understanding of my subject only to what I can find out by doing this particular assay, this particular method of experiment. An astronomer doesn't look through her telescope and say, well, my telescope can only see so far, so I'm going to squeeze my conception of the universe into only what I can see through my telescope. Now, scientists know that their method has to fit reality, not the other way around. Scientists know that reality is always bigger than what we can see at the moment, always greater than what we can grasp with a particular experiment. And to try and squeeze ourselves into what we can find out experimentally is always to distort reality. And really, I think that's what lies behind the very unsatisfactory biologistic image that this reductionist approach leaves us with. Scientists actually are always asking a very important question. It's called the hypothetical question. The question, what if? What if reality was like this? What if it worked this way? How then would we go about discovering it? A hypothetical question. This is how scientists actually go beyond the limits of their current method. So if we're to go beyond science to understand ourselves, maybe this is a good question to think about. So as we finish, I want us to think about this hypothetical question in relation to the topic of purpose that's already cropped up a few times in our discussion so far. What if there was a purpose to life? What if that purpose was love, as Jesus said? What if the purpose of our brains wasn't just to help us to survive, but actually shock horror to try and help us make sense of the world and our place in it? How would we go about discovering such a thing as purpose? One helpful thought and a quote I've found on this is by a philosopher theologian called Leslie Newbigin. He makes what I think is a very important distinction. He says cause can be discovered by science, I'll move this way, but purpose cannot, because until that purpose has been realized, it is hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Newbigin sees something very important about purpose. Unlike mechanisms of cause and effect, purpose is something that persons have, something that arises in a person's mind, someone who can look forward into the future and anticipate possibilities and form desires and then take steps to achieve and bring about those future possibilities. That's what purpose is. And as such, until a purpose is realized, Newbigin says it's hidden. It's hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. He gives an illustration of a building site. He says, imagine you come across a site with bricks stacked up here and there and some tools lying around and some trenches and things like that. And you decide that there's a purpose to what's going on here. I like that illustration because I think it describes very much the way we encounter life. There's all kinds of signs of purpose around us. There's beauty and sense of meaning and significance, and the sense of right and wrong, the sense of things not being as they should be. And yet there's also all kinds of mess and chaos and unfinished business and loose ends. But if there is a purpose, how would we discover what that purpose is? Newbigin says you've really got two options. You can take the empirical approach and go back later on, once building has reached completion, and discover what that purpose of the building site was. You can wait until the purpose is realized. Or, he says, if you don't want to wait, you can go and talk to the builder, the architect, and ask them to reveal it to you. But then Newbigin says, when it comes to our lives or the universe, waiting around until the end is really not an option. If we're to discover what the purpose of it all is, the one whose purpose it is needs to make it known to us. At the heart of Christianity is a very significant and important claim that the one whose purpose it is has made not just his purposes, but his very self known and knowable to us. one of the early accounts of Jesus' life, the Gospel of John, begins with these very famous words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Goes on to say, actually, I'll stop on that for a minute. So he's saying here that word is the Greek term logos, that Greek philosopher idea that behind everything there is a reason or logic to life, to the universe and everything. And really the secret of a good life, the secret of a meaningful, significant life is to try and discover that logic, discover the reason behind everything, and to live in harmony with it. And John takes that word, logos, that word, and he does something very interesting. He says, he personalizes it. He says, he, the logos is a he. He was in the beginning with God. Ultimate reality, the reason behind everything, the logic behind the universe is not something, but someone. But then he goes even further and he says, and the word, this logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. No one has ever seen God, but the only God, the one who is at the Father's side, he has made himself known. At the heart of Christianity is the claim that God, the one whose purpose it is, has made his very self known to us, has made himself knowable to us, has made himself ultimately accessible to us. The reason, I think, ultimately for science's great success, great power, is not finally because of the ingenuity of scientists, although the ingenuity of scientists need to be celebrated, nor ultimately is it because of the rigors of scientific processes or the institutions. Ultimately, I think science is successful because of the accessibility of its subject matter. Science deals with the stuff you can kind of get a hold of, the stuff you can prod and poke and manipulate and control and take apart and find out the inner workings of. When science advances and takes a leap forward, it's very often because a new technique or a new way of seeing has been invented that allows us to access a whole new swathe of reality and start prodding and poking that as well. Science is successful ultimately because of the accessibility of its subject matter. Christianity says that we can know God, the one whose purpose it is, for exactly the same reason. He's become flesh, he's lived among us, he's made himself accessible to us. What does this mean? Two thoughts as we finish. It means, first of all, that God has opened himself up to our scrutiny. He's made himself accessible to our investigation. The heart of Christianity is this claim that God has entered into history. He's impacted history. He's changed history. He's changed people's lives in history. And that's a claim you can investigate and scrutinize. You can't scrutinize a private revelation in a cave. You can't scrutinize a mystical experience or a lofty philosophy. But this is a claim you can look into. Like a geneticist tracing a vestigial trait back through evolutionary history, or a cosmologist detecting the echoes of the Big Bang, or a paleontologist exploring the impact of an asteroid years ago. So we too can explore and investigate the impact of the life of this person, Jesus Christ, on history. And the gospel writers invite us to do just that. John will go on to say, that which we have seen, which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which our hands have touched, this we proclaim to you. He's saying this is something we can investigate. But more than that, he's saying as well that this isn't just a historical claim to investigate. He's saying that this God, this ultimate reality, is someone we can know personally. Ultimate reality is not something, but someone. Someone, in fact, who has gone to very great lengths indeed to make himself knowable to you and me. Now, I'm a scientist. I understand that kind of claim that ultimate reality is someone who knows me and loves me might make people feel a bit uncomfortable. We scientists are not known as being people. We often prefer dissecting the subjects of our investigation rather than talking to them. But you do see, don't you, by saying I'll only believe in something that I can do an experiment on is ultimately to decide the answer even before you've even begun your investigation. When I first met my wife, Nay, she said to me, hello, my name's Naomi. If at that moment I said to her, look, I'm sorry, I'm a scientist, I can't accept truth by revelation, you're going to have to show me some form of identification, a recent utility bill or something. I know my wife now, and I know for a fact that if I'd done that, she would not be my wife now. I'd never have got the chance to get to know her. My method would have determined my perhaps rather sad reality. If ultimate reality is not something but someone, then the method of approach has to change. To refuse to do that by insisting only to believing in stuff that you can do an experiment on is ultimately an attempt to tell the universe how it should be. Is to try and decide the answer even before you've begun your investigation. It's not ultimately very scientific. I'm going to finish there. I just want to point you to a resource. I've written this talk up and it's now published on a website, which I'll show you by sharing my screen. It's called the Be Thinking website. You can find it here. And you'll see the text of this talk if you want to think about it a bit more. Also, if you want to email me, then please do contact the organisers of this event, and I'd be very happy to take any questions over email. But for now, thank you very much for listening indeed. I hope you have a good evening, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much, John, for that great video. So that brings us to the end of our event. I just want to say, if you have any questions following on from that, anything that's made you think, anything you want to know more about, or anything from our other events that you want to know more about, or really just any questions about faith in the Bible, well, next Thursday we're going to be running an event called Mail a Mawam. So if you post your questions in the link that's in the comments, next Thursday we're going to be answering those questions and then deliver you your answer by post. And we'll put in a Mawam suite for you as well, so do get involved in that. And then the other thing to draw your attention to is next Friday, which is the last event of our series here, we're going to be having an event called Defined by Christ, How Jesus Gives Us an Identity. So if you've been to any of our events this week, and you just want to know a little bit more, you just want to explore even further how the Bible gives us a new identity, I would urge you to come along to that event. That's going to be at 7 o'clock again, live streamed here on our Facebook channel. And there won't be an event tomorrow, we're taking the weekend off, but we'll be back on Monday with an event called Defined by My Wellbeing, How Does My Mental Health Change Who I Am? So do come along to that. And then if you want to know a little bit more again, we're not just here for our events weeks, we're going to be here as well for the rest of term. So I'd like to draw your attention to something called Identity Explored. And I believe there's a little video now to show you more about that. Great, well, I do hope to see you all there. The last thing to say is that in the comments there'll also be a little feedback form for you to fill in. We'd really appreciate it if you could just take a minute to fill those in. What you thought we did well, what we could do better. We just want to hear what you thought about this event. Do follow our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram to see the rest of our events and to see what else is going on in the life of the CU. And I hope to see you at more events soon.